In Washington, a telegram arrives with the blunt finality of peacetime tragedy. It carries no map grid, no casualty table, no coded optimism. It says only that General George S. Patton has died in Germany after the guns fell silent. The war has ended, yet death still follows its commanders home. Dwight D. Eisenhower reads it without an audience. Now the Army's senior uniformed officer, he has learned that emotion is another dispatch best handled quietly, where it cannot mislead others. He folds the paper once, then again, as if containment could make loss manageable. Outside his office window, the capital looks relieved, but the world beyond is not. Europe is a continent of wrecked bridges and armed men waiting for trains, its future unsettled at every rail junction. In the east, Soviet formations remain in place. Peace feels like a loaded weapon, safety half on. A staff aide stands nearby, expecting anger, a barked order, a plan for ceremony. Patton was lightning in uniform. Surely his passing will demand thunder. Instead, the aide sees stillness. Eisenhower's face is unreadable, not cold, but measuring an old commander weighing what an old friend cost, and what he saved. That pause becomes the story's question. In an age that hands out medals and names operations after rivers, why should one sentence after death matter more than bronze? Because sentences outlive parades. They shape doctrine, memory, and the kind of officer a nation chooses to reward. Eisenhower understands that language can command, even in mourning. So we turn back, not to an enemy assault, but to Patton's last months when victory demanded patience, and he had none. In the autumn of 1945, he commanded occupation forces in Bavaria, surrounded by paperwork, tribunals, and microphones. The man who lived by motion found himself judged by politics. His unguarded opinions, once tolerated in battle, now threatened the army's legitimacy at the very moment the next rivalry began to form in shadow. Eisenhower had spent the war deploying Patton and containing him, using his speed while guarding the coalition from his recklessness. Now, with Patton gone, he must choose a final line that honors brilliance without surrendering judgment. The sentence will be printed, repeated, and believed by men who never heard Patton speak, and it will begin here, in a quiet office, with a pen hesitating above paper. Soon we learn why peace became his battlefield. George Patton had walked through the war as if bullets were inconveniences. Sicily, Normandy, the breakout across France, the hard grinding in Lorraine, and the sudden winter crisis in the Ardennes, he survived them all. Then, on 9 December 1945, on an ordinary German road near Mannheim, fate met him after the shooting stopped. There was nothing heroic in the mechanics. A sedan, a military truck, a brief misjudged moment at an intersection. Steel folded, glass burst, and the world went quiet. No enemy fired the shot. No tactical lesson rose from the wreck. It was simply impact and the abrupt subtraction of control. In a war measured by intention, this was pure accident. At the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, doctors did what post-war medicine could: immobilize, reduce swelling, hope. Patton had broken his neck and could not move his limbs. The man who lived by momentum now lay flat, listening to footsteps in corridors, fighting an enemy he could not attack. Stillness. Day after day, the front lines receded beyond reach. Nurses and orderlies remembered his voice more than his pain. Even prone, he issued requests like orders: ask about the weather, the traffic, the next trip. One young orderly heard him insist, almost gently, that he would be riding again soon. It was not denial, it was habit, built by years of advance. A campaign mind, refusing the armistice inside his body. Across the ocean, Eisenhower received updates in clipped cables. He had once depended on Patton's speed to rescue timetables and reputations. He had also feared Patton's tongue, his contempt for politics, his capacity to embarrass an alliance. Now Ike faced a commander's last dilemma. How do you memorialize a weapon that could cut both ways? The shock was not only that Patton died, but how. A man who treated war as a profession was undone by peace's randomness, as if history had grown tired of drama and chose arithmetic instead. It reminded the victorious that survival is never earned permanently. It is merely extended until it is not at all. In December 1945, the world was already rearranging itself. Germany lay defeated, yet suspicion hardened between former allies, and planners spoke quietly of new lines, new doctrines, new wars. Patton's death fell into that tense silence like a dropped tool in a workshop, loud, unavoidable. And in Washington, Eisenhower began searching for the sentence that would control the echo. In the days after Patton's death, Eisenhower had to do something commanders rarely admit is difficult. He had to create a public message that would satisfy the nation's hunger for heroes while protecting the army from the very kind of hero Patton represented. The tribute could not be vague. Vagueness would feel like insult. But it could not be unrestrained. Unrestrained praise would turn Patton into a legend that no institution could later correct. So the sentence began to form one line intended to carry two truths at once. Patton's brilliance was real. His energy had moved divisions and changed outcomes. Yet the qualities that made him effective, certainty, impatience, contempt for restraint, could also damage coalitions, policies, and the fragile legitimacy of victory. Eisenhower needed a line sharp enough to be honest and controlled enough to be responsible. In 1945, reputations were not ornaments. They were tools. The United States was demobilizing millions, reorganizing its forces, and staring at a world already dividing into rival camps. What the army chose to celebrate would become doctrine in disguise. It would influence what kind of officer rose, what kind of aggression was rewarded, and what kind of discipline was expected when the next emergency arrived. A clerk placed blank stationery on Eisenhower's desk. The room smelled faintly of paper and tobacco, the quiet smell of bureaucratic power. Ike's pen hovered. There was a pause, not the pause of a man searching for poetry, but the pause of a man choosing targets. Words could strike like artillery, and they could leave craters. One line could comfort families and recruits, yet also excuse behavior that the post-war army could no longer afford. The paradox was familiar to him. During the war, Eisenhower had managed Patton as much as he had deployed him, steering him toward the enemy while steering his mouth away from microphones. He understood Patton's value precisely because he understood his danger. The tribute would be the final act of that long command relationship, a last piece of control delivered through language. And so the story pivots backward. Before that sentence could be written, before it could stand as public memory, there had to be a man who believed he was more than an officer. Patton came to see himself as the army's true spearpoint, an instrument of shock and speed. Others admired that belief. Others feared it. And in that belief, the war's most useful weapon began to shape its own legend. Patton did not speak about speed as a convenience. He spoke about it as virtue. In his mind, momentum spared infantry from long exposure, kept Germans off balance, and turned fear into forward motion. Hesitation, he believed, was a kind of sin. It bred casualties, invited counterattacks, and surrendered initiative to men who deserved none. Audacity, for Patton, was not recklessness, but discipline applied at high velocity, the moral insistence that wars end sooner when commanders refuse to pause at all. His bookshelf was a private chapel. He read Caesar and the Punic Wars, traced Hannibal's marches, recited Napoleon's maxims, and treated cavalry doctrine like prophecy. Yet he was no antiquarian. He wanted to outrun his idols. Where Hannibal needed elephants and Napoleon needed couriers, Patton had gasoline, radios, and steel tracks. He imagined armored columns as modern legions, not waiting for perfection, but breaking into depth before the enemy could assemble thought into defense, and before their guns could swing. To the men who served under him, Patton arrived like a storm front. One minute the camp was routine, the next it crackled with movement, polish, inspections, and sudden demands. His voice carried across motor pools, sharp as a bugle, and his eyes seemed to search for weakness the way wind finds an open door. Some felt electrified, as if confidence were contagious. Others felt drained, because the same weather that clears the sky can also strip the trees bare. By 1944, belief had hardened into identity. Patton did not merely command an army, he performed a role he thought history required, and cultivated profanity were not costume, but signal and announcement that hesitation had been outlawed. He wanted his soldiers to see themselves as the spear thrown first, the blow that cracks a front and keeps cracking until the enemy collapses. In his own mind he was shock embodied, the army's will made visible to all. Yet the creed carried friction. The certainty that drives tanks forward can also drive empathy out. Patton's impatience for weakness could become contempt. His hunger for obedience could become cruelty, and his confidence in simple truths could become blindness to politics. He measured men by how fast they moved, not by what they endured, and he spoke of enemies and allies with the same edge. In war, bluntness is tolerated as efficiency. In peace, it becomes a liability with consequences. Fame followed him like dust behind a column. Reporters loved the hard language and the uncompromising posture. Soldiers repeated his sayings as if they were marching songs. Patton learned that celebrity was another kind of ammunition. It could pressure superiors, intimidate rivals, and shape expectations before a battle was fought. Gradually, the hunger shifted. He needed victories not only to defeat Germany, but to defeat doubt, to prove, again and again, that his method was the only way to fight today. Against Patton's faith stood another, quieter belief. Eisenhower saw victory not as a single thrust, but as an engineered system: ports, rail lines, air cover, diplomacy, and the compromise that kept allies moving together. One blade could break, a machine could absorb shocks and continue. Ike valued Patton's speed, but feared what speed could excuse. In the coming months, their beliefs would collide inside the same war, and that collision would decide the rules of command. And Eisenhower would speak last. Eisenhower's talent was not the kind that shines in a single charge. It was structural, almost architectural. He could take national pride, rivalry, bruised egos, and incompatible temperaments, and force them into something that functioned, an alliance that moved. In the Mediterranean and then in Northwest Europe, he did not command one army. He coordinated a crowded room of armies, each with its own history, politics, and sense of honor. His battlefield was often the conference table. His belief was blunt and unromantic. Unity was not a slogan, it was a weapon. It meant shared ports, shared fuel, shared airfields, and shared timetables. It meant British and American staff work braided into one plan, so that a setback did not become an argument, and an argument did not become paralysis. In Ike's world, unity created operational gravity, the force that pulled divisions, ships, aircraft, and supplies in the same direction, day after day, until the enemy collapsed under pressure he could not escape. There is a moment, repeated in different rooms across the war, that reveals his method. Confident men speak first, commanders with reputations, sharp opinions, and private loyalties. Eisenhower listens. He does not compete for the loudest sentence. He lets the air fill with certainty. Then he speaks last, as if the decision has been waiting for quiet to arrive. His words are rarely theatrical. They are final. And once spoken, everyone must accept them, because the alternative is disunity, and disunity, to Eisenhower, is defeat. He understood Patton's value quickly. Patton was speed made flesh, aggressive, relentless, and psychologically loud. Where Eisenhower built a machine, Patton could provide its striking fist. He could turn a breach into a rout, and a rout into a pursuit before the enemy could recover. His mere presence altered German expectations. It made them guard roads and bridges they could not spare, because Patton was the commander most likely to appear where he should not be able to appear. But Eisenhower also understood risk. In a coalition war, one careless sentence could sabotage more than a division could repair. A single remark could inflame Allied politics, unsettle occupation policy, or hand propaganda to enemies waiting for fractures. Patton's tongue, in that sense, was as dangerous as any artillery misfire because its damage spread beyond the front and into the fragile agreements that kept the war effort intact. So the long tension formed. Eisenhower had to use Patton without becoming used by him. He needed Patton's momentum, but he could not allow Patton's legend to dictate strategy, to shame restraint, or to turn the coalition into a stage for one man's identity. Leadership, for Ike, meant limiting even the talented, because talent unrestrained could pull the machine apart. The difficulty was that Patton did not experience limits as protection. He experienced them as insult. And the war would eventually force a reckoning, not on a map, but in a hospital tent, when Patton's belief that speed was morality collided with the army's moral and political boundaries. The first fracture would not come from German steel. It would come from Patton's hand, and from what that hand chose to do when a soldier's courage failed. In August 1943, in Sicily, Patton walked through an evacuation hospital where the war sounded distant and the men looked empty. He expected wounds that bled, not minds that shook. A soldier sat trembling, saying he could not take any more shelling. Patton read the tremor as infection. He believed fear spread faster than malaria, and he struck the man, demanding he return to the line. Days later, he repeated it, slapping another exhausted soldier, and the ward went silent. To Patton, discipline was mercy. If panic could be shamed away, then units would hold, and fewer coffins would come home. But the hospital was not a parade ground, and the soldiers were not cowards. They were broken by weeks of artillery and sleepless nights. The slap landed like a verdict on suffering itself. A genius at maneuver had failed a basic human test, and the army had to decide what genius could excuse before war ended and legends hardened. News reached Allied headquarters quickly, carried by doctors and reporters, and it threatened more than one career. Eisenhower did not respond with theatrics. He wrote Patton a private letter that burned with controlled anger, reminding him that battle fatigue was real and that the army could not afford cruelty and triumph. He ordered Patton to apologize to the two men and to the staff who witnessed it. He also removed him from front-line command, not as revenge, but as warning for weapon he needed. Patton, forced to stand before his own troops, delivered an apology that sounded like a man swallowing gravel. The soldiers watched without cheering. They had seen him demand perfection, and they had seen him break it. Some felt relief that the institution had limits. Others felt doubt, because the commander they feared was also the commander they trusted to lead them forward. In that uneasy silence, Patton learned that authority could be withdrawn, and that even victory could not fully protect him from judgment again. The irony was plain. Patton craved admiration, and that craving made him manageable. He could endure danger, hunger, and exhaustion, but he could not endure public disgrace. Eisenhower understood this weakness and used it as restraint, the way a handler uses a lead on a fast dog. Patton would be allowed back into the war only if he accepted the leash. For the first time, speed had to wait on humility, and the army kept its dangerous talent in reserve. Eisenhower did not destroy Patton. He suspended him, shielded the army from scandal, and then quietly prepared to use him again. In 1944, Patton became part of the Great Deception, a visible threat meant to pin German divisions near Calais, while the real invasion gathered elsewhere. It was a strange role for a man built to strike, but it kept his name useful and his mouth supervised. When the time came, Eisenhower would release him like stored energy, and the war would feel his acceleration. That measured decision echoed far beyond Sicily. Without it, Patton might have been dismissed as a brilliant embarrassment, a commander too volatile to trust with a continent-scale campaign. With it, he returned at the hour the Allies most needed speed, and the Third Army legend became possible. Years later, in December 1945, Eisenhower would face the same arithmetic in ink, weighing talent against damage in a single line. But first, the war had to become a machine of fuel and nerves under winter pressure. By mid-1944, the Western Front was no longer a line of heroic charges. It was an industrial system, humming and grinding, armored divisions that consumed fuel like fire, tactical air forces that demanded clear runways and spare parts, depots stacked with rations and shells, railheads feeding truck columns, and ports that became the true gateways of victory. Every mile advanced had a weight in tons. Every delay had a price in men. Command meant managing flow of gasoline, bridges, replacements, weather reports, so that a breakthrough did not starve itself into a pause. On the wall, colored pins looked decisive, but the real battle lived in schedules and inventories, where a missing truck could stall an army. Patton understood this new war with an instinct that felt mechanical. Others saw terrain, he saw time. He listened to engine notes, asked about road surfaces, counted the hours between crossings, and demanded radio nets that kept columns moving like one long nerve. To him, a tank was not steel, it was speed made portable, and speed was the weapon that kept casualties low by ending resistance quickly. His staff learned that a map for Patton was never just geography, it was a promise of motion, and any obstacle was an insult to be bypassed, bridged, or bulldozed. In France, his headquarters tracked gallons as closely as enemy units, because empty tanks were the only surrender he accepted. One staff officer later recalled watching Patton lean over a situation map, the paper lit by a single lamp. The officer expected talk of flanks and strongpoints. Instead, Patton spoke in numbers. How many miles a column could cover before dusk, how many jeeps could fit on a bridge, how long a refuel stop should last, how many intersections had to be controlled to keep traffic from knotting. He traced a route with his finger as if he were drawing a clock hand. The lines on the map became hours, the symbols became gallons. To serve him was to learn that velocity had its own logic, and logic, once broken, could kill silently today. Eisenhower needed breakthroughs, but he needed them safely, safe for the coalition, safe for supply lines, safe for politics. A stalled front could be repaired, a shattered alliance could not. Patton offered the opposite kind of solution. He gambled on speed, on surprise, on the belief that if he moved fast enough, the enemy would never find a stable place to fight. His advances could look like liberation and chaos at once. Towns taken before maps were updated, prisoners gathered faster than cages could be built, gasoline borrowed from tomorrow to win today. Ike admired the results, yet heard the scraping sound beneath them. He knew that every reckless mile forward created an obligation alone. Victories arrived so quickly that they began to excuse the man delivering them. Complaints about Patton's language, his impatience, his constant pressure on exhausted units were filed and then quietly buried under reports of captured crossings and broken German lines. Success is persuasive. It teaches commanders to forgive what they would punish in others. But each mile also inflated Patton's confidence that he was right by nature, not merely right by circumstance. The faster he advanced, the more he spoke as if hesitation itself were treason. Eisenhower watched, calculating the moment when usefulness might cross into risk. In coalition war, a commander's reputation could become a weapon pointed the wrong way and still fire. Autumn slid toward winter, and the roads that had carried Patton's columns began to change. Rain turned fields to suction, rivers rose, and daylight shortened until advance was measured in minutes. German defenses stiffened around the Saar and the Ardennes, and the easy geography of pursuit disappeared. In such conditions, speed cannot be commanded by will alone. It must be earned by discipline, by logistics, by the patience to wait when movement would be waste. Patton hated waiting. Eisenhower feared what impatience might do when traction vanished, and every order depended on men shivering in their trucks. Soon, the front would demand not flamboyant motion, but controlled turning an army pivoting under pressure without breaking. By late 1944, Eisenhower could see Patton clearly, a solution designed for emergency, and a liability revealed by calm. When the system flowed, Patton accelerated it. When the system strained, he might tear it. The coalition needed his pressure on the enemy, but it also needed restraint, because every headline and every offended ally became part of the war's terrain. Patton did not fight that terrain well. Still, the machine Eisenhower built required a blade to cut. And so Patton was given his flag, Third Army, an instrument of speed. Waiting for the moment, speed became survival. In the hedgerows and towns ahead, his legend would either justify him or expose his cost, and the war demanded it. Third Army was not simply assigned to Patton, it was shaped around him. In August 1944, as Allied lines burst out of Normandy, the new army took form like an organism built for pursuit. Long columns of armor and trucks, radio nets that refused silence, engineers ready with bridges, and staff sections that measured success in miles per hour. Patton demanded tempo the way others demanded security. Road junctions became arteries, fuel dumps became lifeblood, and every halt was treated as a medical emergency. To keep moving was not bravado. It was method. Across France, the advance looked effortless on maps, but it was a daily contest with friction. Patton's spearheads raced through gaps left by collapsing German formations, seizing crossings on the Meuse and Moselle, turning towns before their names reached higher headquarters. Behind them, convoys strained along narrow roads, tires shredded by heat, drivers sleeping in minutes, supply officers bargaining for gasoline as if it were ammunition. Each victory expanded the problem it solved. More prisoners to feed, more bridges to guard, more front to cover. Yet Third Army kept pressing east, because Patton believed the enemy could be finished if no one allowed him to breathe. Inside one Sherman, a crew moved with the dull discipline of men who had stopped expecting comfort. The driver kept a lucky coin taped to the dashboard, not from faith but from habit, because habit survived when reason wore out. The gunner counted shells the way a miser counts bills. At night they brewed coffee from muddy water, then lay under the tank to steal warmth from its cooling belly. When Patton's orders came, they did not debate them. They followed the sound of engines ahead and the faint belief that speed might keep the next ambush from forming in time. Patton understood that machines still required men, and men required meaning. His polished helmet, his profanity, the theatrical speeches delivered beside mapboards and dust-coated jeeps, none of it was decoration. It was a signal flare to tired bodies. You were part of something fast, feared, and purposeful. He praised aggression in public and corrected mistakes in private because he wanted the army to feel both seen and driven. Even his impatience served a purpose. It made delay embarrassing. And embarrassment, he knew, could move a unit when exhaustion could not. From Eisenhower's headquarters, the results were undeniable. Patton's formations took ground rapidly, forcing German commanders to retreat before they could rebuild coherent lines. The advance relieved pressure on other Allied armies and fed the public story of relentless liberation. Yet Ike watched with mixed emotions, because every mile Patton gained also amplified Patton's voice. A general who wins quickly becomes harder to correct slowly. Allied political leaders expected discipline from occupation forces and restraint from liberators, and Patton's temperament was not built for careful phrasing. Eisenhower needed his offensive engine, but he also needed the alliance to remain intact. More than once, an aide prepared a reprimand and set it beside other papers, waiting for Eisenhower's signature. It might concern an unnecessary insult, a reckless public remark, or a demand that ignored a neighbor's supply crisis. Then a new report would arrive, another bridge captured, another pocket collapsed, another German unit disarmed without a costly set-piece fight. Victory did not erase the problem, but it postponed punishment. In wartime, usefulness can buy silence, and silence can harden into precedent. Eisenhower let the draft sit, because the campaign still required the speed only Patton seemed able to manufacture. That was the deeper irony of Third Army. Patton's speed created outcomes, and outcomes created a legend that began to outrun the chain of command. Newspapers and soldiers spoke of him as if he were a separate force of nature, proof that war could be won by will alone. The more his name spread, the more his decisions acquired political weight. A misstep could embarrass the coalition, yet an order to slow him could look like jealousy, even sabotage. Patton sensed it, and he pushed harder, certain that history rewarded the men who refused caution. But war has its own corrections. By late autumn, the front thickened, supplies tightened, and German resistance hardened behind rivers and winter skies. Patton's columns could outrun their fuel. His appetite for movement could collide with the plain physics of mud, ice, and broken bridges. Eisenhower's machine needed speed, but it also needed balance, because a stalled army could invite disaster. In December 1944, that disaster came with sudden precision. While Patton's reputation was still rising, Germany gathered one last strike in the forests of the Ardennes, aiming to split the Allies and shatter their confidence. And when the line buckled, legend would stop being a story and become a requirement. In the early hours of 16 December 1944, the Ardennes erupted with a winter surprise the Allies had convinced themselves was impossible. German armor and infantry poured out of fog and forest, punching into thin American lines. Snow swallowed landmarks. Radios failed in valleys. Road signs vanished under ice. Assumptions collapsed faster than maps could be updated, and in that collapse time became blood. A regiment delayed was a town lost. A town lost was a junction surrendered. In the Ardennes, minutes were measured in men. For Eisenhower, the crisis was not simply tactical. It was a command problem, shaped like an engineering fault. The system had been jolted, and if coherence was not restored quickly, the enemy would widen the break. He needed to rethread communications, reassign reserves, stabilize morale, and create a front where none existed. It was less like directing a charge, and more like repairing a machine while it still ran. Somewhere behind the chaos was a simple requirement: move strength to the threatened point faster than the Germans could move success. On 19 December, at Verdun, Eisenhower gathered commanders and demanded solutions without panic. In that room sat Patton, already thinking in roads and hours. Patton had anticipated such a moment, and when asked how soon he could strike north to relieve Bastogne, he answered with the certainty of a man who treats time like a weapon. Within days. It sounded impossible. Armies do not turn like rifles. They turn like ships. But Patton's Third Army was built to pivot, and his staff had quietly prepared contingency plans for just such a shock. The pivot became his most famous operational feat, and it was not magic. It was staff work under pressure, rerouting divisions, reassigning fuel, clearing traffic knots, prioritizing bridges, issuing schedules that left no room for hesitation. Columns turned north in the dark, headlights dimmed or masked, moving through villages whose windows were blacked out and whose roads were glazed with ice. Military police at crossroads waved vehicles through with bare hands because light would invite attack. Drivers watched the thin, white line of snow at the road's edge and prayed it was not a ditch. One driver later remembered gripping the wheel until his fingers went numb, trying to keep a truck in the lane he could barely see. Regulations forbade full headlights. The war depended on darkness. He leaned forward, eyes aching, following the faint glow of the vehicle ahead as if it were a lifeline. Somewhere in the back, fuel cans sloshed and chains rattled. The truck was not carrying glamour, only the ordinary necessities of combat: ammunition, rations, spare parts. Yet the driver felt, with a clarity that needed no speech, that this one convoy mattered. If it arrived late, men in Bastogne would pay the difference. Bastogne itself was more than a name on a map. It was a road hub, a nervous system node, and the Germans understood that taking it would let them flow west. American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne held the town under encirclement, artillery falling into streets and fields with mechanical regularity. They waited for relief in frozen foxholes, rationing ammunition and warmth, hearing rumors the way starving men hear meals. When Patton's spearheads pushed through, it was not simply a local victory. It was proof that speed, when used at the right moment, could repair a collapsing front. Eisenhower watched the relief as both commander and caretaker. Patton's method had worked because the crisis made it necessary. In stable conditions, Patton's impatience could disrupt. In catastrophe, impatience became salvation. The paradox sharpened into something Eisenhower could not ignore. The man he had to restrain for political safety was the man who could save the line when politics became irrelevant. Patton was both risk and remedy, depending on how close the edge was. The Ardennes battle would grind on into January, but one truth had already been established in December. Patton's legend was no longer merely a headline. It was now stitched into Allied survival. That made him too important to dismiss, and too famous to manage casually. And as the war pushed toward its end, Eisenhower would face the harder problem that followed every emergency: what to do with the weapon once the crisis passed. By the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing under a pressure that felt less like a battle and more like a closing vice. Allied armies pushed across the Rhine, broke through remaining defensive lines, and entered cities that had once seemed unreachable. The pace of war changed. Pursuit gave way to control. A commander who had measured success in miles now had to measure it in prisoners processed, bridges secured, food distributed, and order restored. Victory arrived, but it arrived carrying paperwork. For Patton, this shift was not a simple inconvenience. It was a psychological wound. His mind had been trained to live inside motion, inside the decisions that come when engines are running, and the enemy is still capable of surprise. Now his days filled with meetings, directives, and protocols. Occupation required patience, and patience was a muscle Patton had never developed because war had never rewarded it. He was built for enemies, not committees, built for the clarity of a front line, not the ambiguity of a defeated population still living among ruins. Eisenhower's priorities had already moved ahead of the last shot. He could see the next phase forming in the gaps between Allied smiles. There were occupation policies to enforce, boundaries to respect, and political consequences hanging over every command decision. Millions of American soldiers wanted to go home, and the pressure to demobilize was as real as any artillery barrage. At the same time, relations with the Soviet Union cooled quickly, turning cooperation into suspicion. The first tremors of the Cold War were not announced. They were felt, like a shift in the ground beneath headquarters. Patton remained brilliant at maneuver, but maneuver was no longer the central problem. He was given command of the Third Army's occupation role in Bavaria, a responsibility that required restraint in speech as much as competence in administration. It placed him in a world where words traveled faster than tanks. A remark could become a headline, and a headline could become a diplomatic incident. Patton had never treated speech as a weapon to be stored safely. He treated it like a saber always out. There is a small moment that captures the change. Patton studies a schedule of ceremonies and inspections, names of officials, dates for conferences, lists of obligations that do not end with a captured bridge. He does not rage. He simply stares, as if trying to understand the logic of a war that demands no attack order. He misses the clarity of artillery timetables, the simple honesty of fire at this hour, advance at that hour. The occupation timetable offers no such certainty. It offers only expectations, and expectations are harder to defeat. His blunt opinions became more dangerous now than they ever were in battle. In combat, a commander's harshness can be tolerated because it seems aimed outward, toward the enemy. In peace, harshness turns inward toward civilians, toward allies, toward the political framework that defines victory itself. Patton spoke about Germans, about former Nazis, and about the moral complexity of occupation with a roughness that suggested he still saw the world as a map of adversaries. He could not easily accept that the mission had shifted from destroying Germany's capacity to fight to rebuilding Germany's capacity to live without chaos. Eisenhower understood what was happening, and he had little patience for it. Patton's aggression had been an asset in war. It produced pressure, initiative, and psychological dominance. In peace, the same aggression looked like insubordination, because it challenged policy rather than enemy troops. A commander who refused to adapt could threaten the legitimacy of American authority at the very moment the world was watching how victors behaved. Eisenhower had spent the war containing Patton to protect the coalition. Now he had to contain Patton to protect the peace. The irony deepened because Patton did not feel less loyal. He felt more honest. He had always believed that truth spoken loudly was strength, but the post-war world required a different strength: restraint, diplomacy, and the ability to let imperfect systems hold. Patton's identity was still built around shock. The new mission demanded steadiness. Thus, the stage was set for consequence. A hero could survive Sicily, Normandy, Lorraine, and the Ardennes, yet be undone by the rules of peace rules written in policy memos instead of blood. Patton was approaching the moment when the army would decide whether he remained an instrument of national purpose or became a public problem. And just as that decision tightened, fate would intervene in a way no commander could plan for. In the months after Germany's surrender, Patton's battles became public and political. His words, once tossed into the noise of war, now landed in the quiet of headlines. In occupation Germany, careless remarks and blunt comparisons were no longer a private flaw. They were a diplomatic hazard. The burden of being a symbol settled on him like dust after an explosion, every sentence examined, every opinion weighed, as if the world were still deciding what kind of victor America intended to be. Eisenhower's role, in that atmosphere, became quietly decisive. He was no longer only winning a war, he was protecting the army's legitimacy. While the defeated watched, the Allies judged, and the next rivalry took shape beyond the ruins. Occupation policy required discipline without cruelty, firmness without revenge, and language that did not sound like conquest. The institution could tolerate errors in battle, it could not tolerate disorder in peace. Inside Patton's headquarters, subordinates began to sense the change before orders made it official. A staff officer who had once measured danger in artillery ranges now measured it in microphones. He watched reporters arrive, notebooks open, and felt the strange reversal. The war's most feared commander was now being evaluated by civilians whose weapons were questions. Patton, impatient with the whole performance, treated the press as a nuisance and the political world as a distraction, unaware that in 1945, the political world was becoming the battlefield. When Patton spoke loosely about former Nazis, about administration, about the nature of occupation, the reaction came swiftly. Complaints rose through channels that had once carried requests for air support. The army could not afford the impression that its occupation forces were indifferent to the moral meaning of victory. Patton's legend still thrilled many soldiers, but the institution began stepping away from the man, narrowing his authority while leaving the myth intact. His command influence shrank, even as his name remained enormous. There is a particular loneliness in that kind of fall. In war, Patton had been surrounded by necessity. Everything he did had immediate purpose. In peace, he was surrounded by procedure, and procedure does not admire genius. The narrator's lens widens to a familiar pattern in moral psychology. Warriors often struggle when the mission no longer matches their identity. The habits that kept them alive, certainty, aggression, contempt for hesitation, become liabilities when society asks for patience, nuance, and restraint. Patton did not feel he was changing. He felt the world had changed incorrectly. He was a man built to strike, and now he was asked to administer, to compromise, to treat speech as a strategic resource. The discipline he demanded from others was difficult to demand of himself. The same fire that had driven columns across France now burned against the limits of post-war reality, where a careless line could damage what a division could not repair. For Eisenhower, this was a colder form of leadership than any battlefield decision. He had to limit a man who had delivered indispensable results, and he had to do it without turning a hero into a martyr. Friendship could not override responsibility. Eisenhower understood that institutions survive by controlling their legends, and that the Army's future, its professionalism, its public trust, its place in a tense new world could not be tied to one commander's temperament. So Patton was moved aside, reassigned, and gradually displaced from the center stage he believed he had earned. He remained alive, honored, and famous, yet increasingly out of place, as if the war had ended and left him stranded in a role he could not perform. The tragedy was not only professional, it was personal. A man who had defined himself by motion found himself constrained by the very victory he had helped create. And then fate intervened without strategy or meaning. No enemy planned it, no staff officer could prevent it. The turning point tightened, quietly and suddenly, toward a road in Germany where the war's aftermath would deliver its final, indifferent blow. On the morning of 9 December 1945, there was nothing theatrical about Patton's schedule. Germany was quiet in the way defeated countries become quiet. Roads open, checkpoints routine, winter air thin and cold. Patton rode in the backseat of a staff car near Mannheim, heading toward a hunting trip, his mind still restless in a world that no longer offered fronts to break. The countryside passed like any occupied landscape, bare trees, grey fields, the hard geometry of European villages. Then the moment arrived, without warning and without meaning. At an intersection, a military truck moved into the car's path. There was a brief, violent compression of metal. Glass burst. A sound like a slammed door became something final. The crash lasted seconds, but it rearranged a life built on movement into a future defined by stillness. In the immediate aftermath, men spoke in short commands, as if speed could undo what had already happened. But the body does not negotiate with impact. Patton's injuries were specific, clinical, and unforgiving. His neck had broken. His spinal cord had been damaged. He could not move his arms or legs. A commander who had demanded relentless advance was now dependent on hands that were not his own. They carried him into medical care, not with the drama of a battlefield evacuation, but with the careful silence reserved for something fragile that might shatter again. The 130th Station Hospital at Heidelberg became the war's cruel epilogue. Patton lay in a bed instead of a command jeep, surrounded by doctors instead of soldiers, listening to medical voices replace radio chatter. Tubes and braces took the place of maps. The war had once been a contest of will and logistics. Now it was a contest between swelling and time, infection and hope. The staff did what they could: immobilization, careful monitoring, attempts to preserve function, but the injury was beyond the era's ability to repair. In 1945, medicine could save many men from bullets. It could not restore a severed future. In the quiet hours, Patton's thoughts drifted to small things. He asked about Christmas. He asked about his family, about home, about whether he might travel again. Those questions were not strategy. They were human. Beneath the famous voice and the cultivated steel, there was a man measuring his life in ordinary hopes, as if normality might be a bridge back to motion. An orderly heard him speak with a gentleness that surprised him. Patton was still commanding, still resisting the idea of defeat, but now the enemy was immobility, and immobility did not care who he had been. Across the Atlantic, Eisenhower received updates that arrived like slow artillery, each message tightening the distance between legend and mortality. In wartime, he had read casualty reports in bulk, numbers that demanded decisions. This was different. This was one name, one life, reduced step by step. He had known Patton as a force of nature, loud and kinetic, a man who seemed immune to the ordinary endings of men. Now the cables described blood pressure, complications, and the hard limits of spinal injury. The language of command was replaced by the language of medicine, and it made the tragedy feel colder. The central irony sharpened with each day. The general who had preached speed as morality was trapped in the slowest prison imaginable. His own body. He had chased tempo across continents, insisting that hesitation killed, that movement saved. Now movement was gone, and nothing could be demanded back from it. The war had ended, yet it had found a final way to claim one of its most famous instruments, not with an enemy bullet, but with a collision on a quiet road. When death came on 21 December 1945, it did not feel like drama. It felt like subtraction, an engine switched off. The world did not change shape in that instant, but something essential vanished from it, a particular kind of aggressive energy that had helped drive victory. Patton's story ended not with a last charge, but with silence, as if history refused him the farewell he would have chosen. The climax, however, was not in Heidelberg. It was in Washington. Eisenhower now faced a different kind of battle, the battle of language. How do you write a sentence that can hold affection and truth, admiration and restraint? How do you honor a man whose genius you needed and whose flaws you spent years containing? Patton was gone, but his legend was about to begin its longest campaign on paper, in memory, in doctrine, and Eisenhower's pen would decide the opening line. Patton's death forced Eisenhower into a task no field order could solve. He had to command memory. Grief could be private, but the army's story could not. Millions of soldiers were returning home. Newspapers were already shaping heroes, and the world was watching how America spoke about its generals. Eisenhower understood that a tribute, if written carelessly, would not merely mourn, it would teach. It would tell young officers what sort of brilliance was prized and what sort of brilliance was dangerous. So he framed the line around Patton's truest battlefield identity, the one nobody disputed. He was born to be a soldier, not born to be a politician, not built for committees, but fitted to combat the way an engine is fitted to motion. In Sicily, in France, in the Ardennes, Patton had made daring plans feel workable because he insisted they must work. His confidence traveled down radio nets, through staff tents, into cold foxholes. Men who doubted the map would still follow the voice that treated doubt as something to outrun. In a back office, far from any front, a clerk rolled fresh paper into a typewriter and waited for the dictated words. The keys would strike with a small metallic snap, each letter appearing like a stamped decision. No band played, no rifles fired. Yet the clerk sensed, in the stillness, that he was helping fix a name in place. Outside, winter light lay flat on Washington streets. Inside, the Army's highest officer reduced a complicated man to a single sentence that could be repeated without explanation. Eisenhower's praise carried a subtext that only professionals would hear. He did not pretend Patton was easy, or safe, or universally wise. Instead, he honored the one arena where Patton's gifts were undeniable, war itself. The compliment was a boundary disguised as admiration. By defining Patton as a combat leader, magnificent in battle, Eisenhower also implied that outside battle the same force required supervision. Patton's value had been real, so real that it had to be directed, limited, and sometimes restrained to keep the larger purpose intact. Such sentences do not remain on condolence paper. They migrate. They are quoted at memorial services, printed in newspapers, taught in staff colleges, and repeated in barracks by men who never met the subject. In time, they become shorthand, a compressed biography that fits on a plaque. They become doctrine in human form, an approved example. They become mythology, because the public prefers clean silhouettes to complicated profiles. And they become recruitment posters, because nations enlist the future by romanticizing the past. Eisenhower knew this machinery of memory as well as any logistics chart. To most Americans, the tribute read as simple admiration. Here was the victorious Supreme Commander acknowledging the man who had driven deep into Germany. The public heard courage, energy, and a kind of old cavalry romance translated into tanks. But inside headquarters, among officers who had watched Patton tested and corrected, the sentence carried a careful limit. It honored without surrendering judgment. It praised the weapon while reminding the institution that weapons are meant to be handled. In that balance lay Eisenhower's final act of command over Patton. Not a rebuke, not a dismissal, but a definition. The consequence landed quietly, yet it was lasting. Patton's legend, already loud with battlefield stories, was sealed shut by Eisenhower's authority. From then on, memory would hold Patton chiefly as the man of attack, the commander whose presence made movement seem possible when others calculated risk. That was true, and the army could safely admire it. What the sentence did not do was endorse everything Patton had been. It did not sanctify his impatience, his political carelessness, or his capacity to wound the very men he inspired. It froze him at his best moment, and by doing so it protected the institution from his worst. Even his critics could accept that framing, because it separated the brilliance of action from the complications of character, and it allowed the army to mourn without inheriting every habit too. In the years ahead, when officers argued about aggression and restraint, they would cite Patton as evidence for both. Eisenhower had given the public a hero and given professionals a warning wrapped in praise. With one line, he granted Patton immortality and placed a fence around it. Yet fences invite questions. What kind of genius did the army lose that winter? And what kind of danger did it escape? Those answers would be measured not in sentiment, but in what came next, when a new world demanded new generals. From a macro distance, Patton's death looks like the removal of a rare operational talent at exactly the wrong moment. The world he left behind did not settle into harmony, it divided. In 1945 and 1946, lines hardened between former allies, and planners in Washington and Moscow began to imagine the next conflict before the last was fully buried. The United States was shrinking its forces, reorganizing its commands, and trying to define a doctrine for a new era of air power, rockets, and political confrontation. In such a world, a commander who understood movement, pressure, and initiative could still be valuable. Patton had been unusually gifted at turning mechanics into momentum, at making large formations behave like sharp instruments. His absence removed an option from the table, yet history is not only the view from headquarters. In the memories of veterans, Patton survives in fragments sharp, contradictory pieces. Some recall the profanity, delivered not as humor, but as energy, a way to turn fatigue into indignation, and indignation into motion. Some remember his certainty, the way he spoke as if the future were a simple road, and the only sin was stopping. Others remember how he could make fear feel shameful, not with cruelty for cruelty's sake, but with a belief that shame could force men to do what courage alone could not. For a soldier who needed steel, Patton was a source of it. For a soldier already cracked, he could be a hammer. This is where the uncomfortable question begins. How much collateral damage does genius produce, and how much do institutions tolerate when results arrive fast? Patton's victories had real value: fewer days of fighting, fewer opportunities for the enemy to stabilize, and at times fewer losses than slow, grinding attacks might have caused. But his method also imposed costs that do not fit neatly into after-action reports. Exhausted units pushed beyond rest, civilians and allies offended by careless words, soldiers shamed when they were already near breaking. The same fire that burned through German defenses could burn through human limits. An institution at war may excuse those burns. An institution building a peace cannot. Eisenhower's sentence, read again in this light, becomes moral arithmetic. It assigns credit where credit is due: combat brilliance, operational daring, the ability to inspire movement under pressure. But it also implies danger without announcing it. By fixing Patton as a man born to be a soldier, Eisenhower preserves complexity while presenting simplicity. The public receives a hero whose purpose was clear. The professionals hear a subtle admission. Patton's greatness was conditional, tied to the environment of war, and therefore not universally transferable to every mission that followed. The post-war army that emerged needed different virtues. It needed professionalism that could survive scrutiny, politics that could be navigated without contempt, and restraint that could keep a global presence from becoming an imperial posture. It needed officers who understood that victory was not only defeating an enemy, but maintaining legitimacy afterward. In a world of alliances, occupations, and nuclear anxieties, a general could not be only a fighter. He had to be an administrator, a diplomat, and a symbol. Patton resisted those roles in temperament and in belief. He treated diplomacy as delay. He treated restraint as weakness. Those instincts had served him in the moment of breakthrough. They could have endangered him in the moment of settlement. The irony sharpens into a final contrast. The war needed Patton's fire. It needed a commander who could drive into uncertainty and make it seem like advantage. But peace needed Eisenhower's containment, the careful management of personalities, the measured language, the patience to keep a fragile system from tearing itself apart. Patton and Eisenhower were not opposites of competence, they were opposites of purpose. Each represented a different requirement of modern power, the ability to strike and the ability to hold. So, what did the army lose? It lost a rare gift for operational acceleration, a man who could create momentum when others created plans. And what did it escape? It escaped the risk of a legend too powerful to govern, of a commander whose public force might outgrow institutional control in a politically sensitive era. Greatness can be true and still be unfit for the next chapter. That is not an insult. It is a warning, history repeats. And in December 1945, Eisenhower's sentence quietly admitted it before the world fully understood what kind of war was coming next. We return to Eisenhower's office, where grief has been translated into procedure, and procedure into history. The sentence is finalized, signed, and released beyond the walls of headquarters. Once it leaves his desk, it no longer belongs to Eisenhower. It becomes public property, printed in newspapers, repeated in memorial remarks, carried in letters, and stored in the quiet places where nations keep their chosen stories. The war is over, but memory is beginning its own campaign. Seen in full, the journey was never simply about two famous generals. It was about a permanent problem of modern command, how to balance effectiveness with responsibility. Eisenhower did not merely command Patton as a subordinate. He managed him as a force directing his power toward the enemy, insulating allies from his impatience, and preventing his fame from turning into an independent policy. That management was not weakness. It was strategy. In coalition war, the commander who holds the alliance together often decides victory more than the commander who advances fastest. Somewhere in Europe, far from Washington, a soldier hears the tribute through rumor or a newspaper passed hand to hand. He does not analyze the politics. He remembers something simpler, the feeling of being pushed forward when fear felt heavy. He remembers Patton's voice, the hard certainty, the insistence that movement itself could outrun death. Veterans rarely remember doctrine. They remember tempo, the long days of dust and engine heat, the nights when orders came and the body moved before the mind finished doubting. For that soldier, the tribute is not a sentence. It is permission to remember without explaining. Patton's life remains a paradox, because war rewards paradox. He was brilliant at the art of momentum, inspiring in his demand for courage, and reckless in his impatience for limits. He could make a plan seem possible simply by refusing to admit it might fail. He was also capable of cruelty, blind to political consequence, and dangerously certain that his instincts were identical with truth. He ran hottest when others hesitated, and that heat won battles. It also scorched those closest to him, because fire does not choose what it burns. Eisenhower's leadership is another paradox, quieter but no less decisive. Gentle in manner, he was hard in decisions. He did not seek glory as a personal possession. He built victory as a shared structure. He understood that modern war is not only fighting, it is diplomacy, supply, morale, and the discipline to sacrifice personal pride for collective purpose. He was an architect of unity, and unity required him to disappoint talented men, to correct them, and sometimes to restrain them for the sake of something larger than any single reputation. Here is the moral reversal that sits at the heart of the story. Patton, who loved speeches and cultivated theater, is ultimately immortalized not by his own words, but by Eisenhower's measured sentence. The man who had to stop him, redirect him, and sometimes punish him, becomes the man who frames his legacy for the world. In that reversal is a quiet truth about institutions. They do not remember heroes exactly as heroes remember themselves. They remember what is useful, what is safe, and what can be taught without destroying the system that must endure. Eisenhower's sentence, therefore, functions like a final command. It honors Patton's essence: combat leadership, daring, the refusal to accept stagnation while containing the parts that could not be carried into peace. It gives the public a hero to admire, and gives the army a legend with boundaries. It is a compromise between affection and governance, between respect for talent and respect for consequence. In wartime, Patton had demanded speed from the world. In death, Eisenhower demands restraint from memory. And so the story ends where it began. In quiet, with paper, with a decision made in ink rather than steel. Patton is gone. But his myth continues, shaped by the one commander who knew exactly how powerful and how perilous he could be. The war produced thunder, but peace demanded containment, and history kept both truths in the same line. He fought like a thunderstorm, and the final sentence that honored him also admitted why peace could not keep him.